Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Do settle down as you absorb the benefits of nature. Amongst the resources, or the ecosystem services as we call them, is of course food and water and wine. And so I hope you've had your fill. I want to talk today for 15 minutes about what is called the economics of ecosystems and biodiversity. And I wish it was not called something so complicated, because it's just about the economics of nature. The project is called TEEB, T-E-E-B, and I wish it were called TEN, T-E-N, the economics of nature. It would have made life certainly a lot easier for journalists and policymakers and commentators, but unfortunately it is what it is. This project began in 2007 and was started by the G8+5, and they gave the effort of organizing it to the European Commission and to the United Nations thereafter. Several of you are familiar with the reports that we produced on UN in Nagoya in Japan. We produced a whole series of reports meant for policymakers, separately for local governments and administrators, separately for businesses, and finally a few websites to get the message across to people as to what is the problem. And the key issue here is about the economic invisibility of nature. Nature provides a lot to us: clean air, fresh water, food, fuel, fiber, ecosystem services such as the prevention of damage from floods and cyclones, the retention of soil, the recycling of nutrients. All of these things are services from nature, and they are valuable to the economy. But most of these services come free. Nature does not charge for them. How many times have you seen bees or insects giving you an invoice for pollination services? That doesn't happen. So because of this economic invisibility, there is a problem, which is that these services are depleted. The resources that generated them, the capital, natural capital that generates them, is lost. It's because we do not attach value to what doesn't have a price. And because all of this, more or less, does not trade in markets, nature does not have markets for its services. Because of that, we find that the lack of price results in an impression that there is lack of value, and these things are treated as free goods. That's called the tragedy of the commons. An example of this is, of course, rainforests. Now, if you look at rainforests, they actually contain and capture something like 1/4 of the total carbon that is stored on Earth, on the land surface. Rainforests are also amazing mitigation engines, which means that they are, on an ongoing basis, absorbing carbon dioxide net from the atmosphere. So they're actually absorbing something like 5 gigatons of carbon dioxide compared to the 32 gigatons that globally our economy emits, which means that they are already capturing 15% of our emissions. That makes them the world's biggest mitigation engine. And the question that has to be asked is that is hugely valuable, that mitigation service. Is anyone paying for this? In fact, until recently, and the RED Plus schemes that are being considered and discussed here at the conference, in fact, nobody was paying for these services and has not been for all these years and decades. Another example, also from rainforests, is about freshwater. The Brazilian rainforest, for example, is not just a carbon store and a house of various species, but it's also a water pump. And that water pump provides the rainfall by precipitating the northeastern trade winds from the Atlantic into the plains of the La Plata, the basin, which is basically the granary of Latin America. $1 trillion economy in Latin America hinges upon the availability of agricultural production for exports and for their consumption. And that in turn hinges upon freshwater. So it's a clearly important part of their economic cycle, and yet does the governor of Amazonas, for example, does he get paid anything by the governor of Mato Grosso, or for that matter Argentina or Uruguay or Paraguay? No. Once again, because this service is economically invisible. Now, is there a problem with this? The problem is, yes, there is. Because of this economic invisibility, the profits of corporations are actually not a really good measure of what value we add, and I speak as a businessman. They are not a good measure of the value that we add to society. We make profits, and we may make losses for the public because of our carbon dioxide emissions, because of our use of fresh water, because of our emissions, because of pollution, because of chemical pollutions, and so on. And a company has estimated that value, that cost to society of doing business as usual, and that is legal business as usual. That cost is almost $2 trillion. And if we add to the top 3,000 companies the cost of other companies and the cost of government business, in other words, public sector, that is almost as much as $6 trillion, which means almost 10% of the world's economy of global GDP is every year being borne by society as a cost. That's the cost of doing business. So the first reason why nature's economic invisibility is a problem is that it is just too significant. It is too big to ignore. We can't keep calling it externalities, as some economists like to do. They are just too important for us. We cannot ignore them. A second aspect of this is about poverty, because when we calculate how much these services are worth, and you can work out how much it will cost you to get fresh water and nutrients if you don't get it from nature, when we calculate that, the answers between countries like Indonesia, India, and Brazil are in the range 10 to 20% of their GDP on an annual basis. But that's not a good comparison, because when you ask the question, to whom did these benefits flow? If the forest is lost or the cover is lost, where will the poor farmer's wife go for fuel wood? Or where will his cattle go for leaf litter? Or where will he get his fresh water and nutrient flows from to feed his fields? Or who is going to protect his fields and his crops from the effects of droughts and floods which happen in the absence of forests? Nobody. This is the problem, because when we work out how much these benefits from nature are worth to the poor farmer and his household, these household benefits, household incomes, these are almost 50 to 90% of the total incomes. And that is why it is even more important. So nature, you see, is not just something beautiful and distant and lovable to admire from afar. It is also something that is directly valuable to the economy, and most importantly, it is essential as a safety net for the poor and as part of their household incomes, 50 to 90% of their household incomes. That is why the economics of nature has a very important message for development. When we are seeking development models, when we are trying to reduce poverty, when we are trying to improve the lives of the poor, we can't do that by losing their safety net and saying, please come to the city and make Ferraris. That doesn't work. 1.2 billion people around the world who are subsistence farmers and families of theirs cannot come around to cities and build Ferraris. There just isn't that much demand for that kind of production. So we have to think of a different economic paradigm. That economic paradigm has to include the recognition of natural capital. And I was delighted to hear from a colleague from World Bank this morning, because the World Bank has launched a project recently which accounts for the value of natural capital in the national accounts. And when that moves forward, as it is right now, I was at their first meeting, we will finally have the true wealth of nations being reflected in their own balance sheets, which has not happened so far because of the economic invisibility of nature. So once again, another strong reason why we have to address this problem. You might think something like coral reefs, another example, is just a question of pretty biodiversity, but it's not, because more than 500 million, 500 million people around the world in so many parts of the globe, including here around the islands of Indonesia and the Asia, Southeast Asia, depend on coral reefs for their livelihoods, not just the food, but also their livelihoods. So the loss of coral reefs due to climate emissions, partly because of increasing temperatures, partly because of acidification, is a big problem. That is a social problem. Once again, the economic invisibility of that and the social cost. When poor people do not get food and livelihood, they have to move. They can't just move to anybody else's homes. They have to be given alternatives, and this is not straightforward. If we do nothing about it, then we are risking the potential of conflagration. We are risking that we push poverty. Poverty is not just about lack of food and shelter. It's also about self-respect and of having livelihoods. And when people do not have livelihoods, that self-respect cannot be. And when that happens, you're taking a risk. Because just like at times phase changes, when ice turns to water and turns to steam, things happen suddenly. And you do not want that to happen, because that is political, social disaster. We talked a lot in our TEEB reports about what needs to be done, and we wrote separately for local governments. And here's an example of success stories. This is in Uganda, in Kampala, where they were about to cover up a wetland because they felt that its value as an agricultural land was better, until an economist worked out that the value of this wetland as a kind of waste disposal facility, basically a sewage facility for the city of Kampala, was actually 8 to 10 times higher than its value as a converted agricultural land. Then they changed their minds, thankfully, due to good economic thinking. Another example, the loss of the white stork in Japan was a big loss to the people because they felt for this animal. And they wanted it back, but to do that, they had to reintroduce organic farming, which they did in about 200 hectares. That's not very big. But thanks to that, not only has the white stork come back to the city of Toyooka, but also they are able to brand the rice that they grow there as white stock rice, which sells at a premium, so there's an economic value. And that premium is also even higher, up to 50%, if it is sold as organic and not just improved rice. And thanks to that, not only is there a catchment of new species, but there's biodiversity marketing going on, there's ecotourism going on. They make something like $10 million a year extra just because of this ecotourism. And their revenues have gone up 1.4%, which in Japan is not a small number. Another example of why it matters. And if we look at what is happening around the world in many aspects of certification, be it forest certification or fisheries certification, there are many, many companies and many, many markets where this is really moving at a very accelerated pace. Certified products and their sales are growing much, much faster than uncertified products. And this is a very interesting result for companies to look at. And you can see some of the companies who are involved in this. They are big names. We're talking about Mars, Cadbury, Kraft, Unilever. So these are not exactly fly-by-night or small-ticket companies. These are center-stage companies. So you see there are examples, economic rationale, both at the local government level and at the business level, why moving forward with recognizing the value of nature can actually help improve performance. Economic performance and the wealth of people both can improve. And the last point that I'll make as to why ending the economic invisibility of nature is important is because of the value it can generate for employment by rebuilding natural capital. I come from India, and one of the stories from there is an example of that, where the government of India 4 or 5 years ago introduced a scheme called the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act. The idea of that is to pay the minimum wage to farmers during the off-season when they're not cropping. And that simple amount of payment is hardly $2.50 a day. But to rebuild local ecology, which means replant forests, which means build dams to catch water, which means improve freshwater availability and soil fertility. Small things like that, which are manual labor intensive, have created 30 million jobs outside season. And that is a hugely important thing, not just because there is employment outside the cropping seasons, but because the quality of soil improves and the availability of freshwater improves and agricultural yields go up. And it is well known that if agricultural yields go up, that is the best solution to reducing poverty. An increase in 10% of yields sometimes leads to up to 5% reductions in poverty as measured by the World Bank, the norms. And that's in Southeast Asia. In Africa, it's up to 7%. A study was done which showed that agricultural yield improvements of up to 80% on average were found across 57 countries and 300 projects as a result of using ecologically friendly farming. Less damaging to nature, once again, a win-win situation. Recognize the economics, apply them, have better results both for society and for reducing poverty and for nature. I want to close by summarizing where we are today and describe to you what is happening in the TEEB project. I'm delighted that the government of India, the government of Brazil are both moving forward with implementing TEEB studies and analyses to be able to apply our strategies. The strategies of land use based on ecosystem service values, strategies of valuation for protected areas to see what value they provide, strategies such as eco-certification and so on. And many other countries, including Germany and Norway, have already announced their national studies. So in both developing as well as developed world, this is moving forward. And I'm also delighted that many of you here whom I've been speaking with are interested on the business applications of TEEB, because there is a TEEB business coalition that has been formed. So many of the demands that have come to TEEB as a result of our studies and our communication of these results have actually already generated further interest. And I'm very pleased that this interest is right here, and that I hope that people like yourselves, businesses such as yourselves, government people, representatives of civil society are all engaged and are able to take this forward. I hope also that there will be pilot projects right here on the green economy in Indonesia, where I believe there to be substantial opportunity. So ladies and gentlemen, the economic invisibility of nature is a problem. Nature is not just a luxury for the rich, it is a necessity for the poor. It is the treasury of the poor. It is important that if you are serious about development, that you give that a thought and you build that thinking into your development model. Thanks very much indeed.